Hope for Anxiety and OCD, episode 69. If you are new to the show, my name is Carrie Bock. I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Tennessee, and our show is all about reducing shame, increasing hope, and developing healthier connections with God and others. Today's show is about learning to let go, and it's for help for people who are struggling with hoarding. And I wanted to say a little bit up front to give credit to where credit is due. Some of this information is taken that I'm going to share with you from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known for short as the DSM, as well as the book Buried in Treasures by Tolland Frost and Stakecki. I hope I pronounced that last name specifically correctly. They have done a great job putting together research and providing practical advice in their book. And then some of the material I'm going to share today is just based on my own personal experience of working with clients who have struggled with hoarding. I've made up various examples. They are not true clients' examples, but they're based on variations of things that I actually have seen. Why in the world are we talking about hoarding on a show for anxiety and OCD? Well, we are talking about hoarding because hoarding is an OCD spectrum disorder in the DSM-5. So there is a section on OCD, followed by hoarding, hair pulling, skin picking. So there's a spectrum of some different things that are classified under OCD. Now, the DSM is what counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists use to diagnose people. So there's various criteria in there for those of you who aren't familiar with the DSM. I should not just assume that you know what that is, and I apologize. A lot of people don't realize that hoarding is part of the OCD spectrum of disorders. So let's look at what are the actual criteria for being diagnosed with hoarding. There's a persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions regardless of their actual value. We all know someone who collects various things, right? And some of those collectibles may be really worth something. So a person with hoarding may have things that are really valuable in their possessions that they could sell for money, but they also may be holding on to things that actually don't have any value. It could be junk mail, recycling, things maybe that once had value but have worn down and are no longer good, or they've been sitting in an attic somewhere where they've overheated and deteriorated. The difficulty getting rid of items is due to a perceived need to save the items and distress associated with discarding them. So there's a need to save the item, and we're trying to not be in distress because when we try to get rid of things, there's a level of emotional or psychological distress that comes up. The difficulty discarding possessions results in accumulation of possessions that congest and clutter active living areas and substantially compromise their intended use. That's the third criteria in the DSM. So, for example, if you have a guest bathroom, but it's so full of extra toilet paper, paper towels, and laundry detergent that you extreme couponed, found on sale, that you can't actually get in that shower and use that guest bathroom. Or maybe there's a kitchen that's so cluttered that you can't actually get in there and cook anything in that kitchen. The fourth criteria is that it inhibits functioning often socially. For example, people who struggle with hoarding may not be able to invite anybody over. They may isolate themselves from other people due to their hoarding disorder. And there is also a potential to add on what is called a modifier to the diagnosis, which is an excessive acquisition, meaning that they keep acquiring items, keep bringing them into the home. So let's talk about how common is hoarding. Hoarding affects actually 2 to 6% of the population, according to the DSM, over 15 million people in the U.S. That's a pretty high number. And it's actually a small percentage of people that struggle actually seek help. Usually there are other people trying to seek help on their behalf. They see this behavior as a problem. And the people that do seek help may have some kind of external pressure on them to get better. So maybe their spouse is really upset. It's causing some intense conflict in the marriage. Maybe they're single and they want to have a relationship, but they feel like, okay, I can't even invite anybody over, so I don't feel like I can date successfully. Maybe they just want to be more socially connected. In examples such as retirement, maybe someone is trying to downsize and move from a full, 3-bedroom house to a smaller townhome, something of that nature, and they're having trouble and they might kind of seek help for this issue. Or they may have some kind of government external pressure. Maybe the codes department has been called on them. Someone's complained about, rubbish in the yard. Maybe social services has gotten involved. Maybe there are children and someone's come in and said, hey, you've really got to clean this area up. Those people don't necessarily want to seek help on their own, but they're kind of backed into a corner and have to, or otherwise they're not going to be able to get what they want. Hoarding typically runs in families, and about half of the people who struggle report also having a relative who hoards as well. So whenever we're looking at things that run in families, it's kind of hard to tease out, is that because there are some genetic components? Is that because this is a learned behavior? If we're seeing other people do something, obviously we may have a tendency to pick up on that. It's quite possible that the individual grew up in a family where there were certain messages surrounding items that they internalized and then therefore are living out in their adult life. Maybe some examples are, hey, that item was a gift. You can't give that away. Somebody really thought of you and they gave you that item. You got to hold on to it. Or, you need to hold on to this item because you might actually need that someday. Yeah, you're not using it right now, but it may really come in handy later. We have to catch that sale. We've got to buy things, even if we don't need them quite yet, while they're on sale. So how does this hoarding develop? Well, it seems like there are some genetic and temperamental components, and that's where the authors of The Buried in Treasures did some research. They put people in MRI machines, and they were having them make decisions while they were actively looking at the areas of their brain that were overactivated or underactivated. It's actually really interesting, and I encourage you to go get the book and read on that if you struggle with hoarding, or if you know someone who struggles. There's also a lot of advice in the book for family members and how to approach your loved one as well. So that may be beneficial if you're listening on behalf of a loved one who's struggling. And what they found through this study was that there were different levels of activity in key parts of the brain between the person struggling with hoarding and the person in the typical population. They had a harder time categorizing their own stuff, but it didn't interfere with them categorizing other people's stuff. So seeing certain things as special kind of can be a common issue. And so then if it's special, it kind of gets its own category, and we can't put things together in other categories. There are some common struggles and overlap that is seen in people who struggle with hoarding in terms of difficulty with attention, making decisions. They tend to be more creative because they look at items and think, oh, well, we could use it this way, or I could use that to do this, that somebody else may not necessarily see the value in something. There may be a tendency to want to do everything perfectly, like struggling with perfectionism, and a tendency to procrastinate, to put things off. Okay, I really do want to organize this. I feel like it's got to be perfect, so then I put it off because I can't do it. It's overwhelming. Maybe someone has, for example, a train collection, and they want to sell this train collection. But first they have to organize the train collection, maybe by type of year, the year it came out, the color. And then I have to figure out, how am I going to sell them? Am I going to put them in a yard sale? Well, no, that maybe seems a lot of work to label everything. And then who wants to do a yard sale with only trains? Well, I could put them on Facebook Marketplace, but then I have to take these pictures and figure out, how do I list that? And if I list it on Marketplace, well, then I have to meet up with somebody. And where am I going to meet up with them? And if I post it on another website to sell it online, I've got to take these pictures and figure out how I'm going to get payment. Do I use the Venmo app? What do I do? Do I use PayPal? And then there's this sense of exhaustion and just feeling defeated. Like, oh, this feels like it's going to be too much work to make this happen, and end up in decision overload. When we end up in decision overload, what happens? We just have this tendency to shut down and not do it. Another issue is the sense of feeling a sentimental attachment. Now, we've all had some level of this, right? We have an item. It's not necessarily worth anything to anyone else, but to us, it's tied to a memory or a specific time in our life. And we think, okay, I don't want to let that go because this attachment to this object reminds me of positive things, or it reminds me of an important person in my life. Maybe it was something that they gave me or something that we did together. One thing I've noticed in my work with people who struggle with hoarding is that they have a tendency to view their better days as being in the past. So they have these items that allow them to reminisce about the past where the better days were. For example, if an individual used to surf, let's say they lived by the ocean, now maybe they don't live by the ocean or they don't go surfing anymore. Maybe they've had an injury where they can no longer surf, but yet they have a collection of surfing supplies. You know, they've got the surfboard, they've got the wax that goes on the board, other things that I don't even know about surfing, but they have the wetsuits, everything that goes with surfing. They've got a whole collection of stuff, yet they're not using it. They're not going to use it because they don't surf. But when I look at that, I think, man, wasn't that really great when I could get out in the water and just feeling the wind on my face and catching a wave. It's awesome. So that's maybe just one example of how someone might hold on to items to really reminisce about good things that they experienced, even though they don't need the items or they're not using the items. We'll talk about a little bit later in terms of healing from that. People may hoard and hold on to things because it's a part of their identity. They may view themselves as a collector. Like, oh, this is a collector's item. I have all of these collector board games from years and years ago that I want to hold on to. They probably are worth something. Maybe a person holds on to craft supplies because they want to view themselves as an artist, or painting supplies, even though they don't paint, but they would like to be able to do some of those things. I know that for myself, having been a foster parent, I had a lot of kid items around the house, and it was hard to get rid of some of those things because being a foster parent obviously had been my identity for that time period, and I didn't know really what the future held for me. You know, maybe I would marry someone with kids, and what if I needed some of these items? It was a process that I had to go through to realize, you know, I'm not living that life anymore. That's not my identity. So I don't need to hold on to things tied to that identity. People may also struggle because they get a high from acquiring possessions. Oh, I saw a great sale at the thrift store. I got these pants for half off, and I got this item, and look, it was only $1. I went to this yard sale, and isn't this awesome? And they may buy stuff that they don't need just because they feel like it's a good price. And then there's this like elevation of self-worth and value that they feel of being able to find this good deal. Now, I mentioned the book Buried in Treasures. This book is a CBT-based book. So it's based on cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's the approach that they take to overcoming hoarding. It's very good material, and one thing that approach hasn't addressed really that I've seen is this tendency of something that I've noticed connected to hoarding, and that's the unresolved and at times traumatic grief and loss that seems to come with it. This attachment to items that are a tangible way of keeping a connection between the person and something or someone that they have lost. It's not always a loved one when we talk about grief and loss, but it can be. It can be a situation where they've lost a loved one, a spouse has died, and they feel like they just can't get rid of their stuff. They've got to hold on to it because somehow that is connected to the memory of that person. And if they let it go, they feel like I am going to lose that person all over again. It also, the loss can be connected to things that they used to be doing but aren't doing anymore. So I gave the example of like being a foster parent in my own life. Other people, they may have been a Sunday school teacher when they were younger. They may have coloring pages. They may have flannel graphs for anyone who remembers those things where you stick the picture on the flannel. Nobody even uses that anymore, but someone might be holding on to it going, oh, that was such a good time. Like when I was a Sunday school teacher and pouring into the little kids, and wasn't that fun and awesome? So really going through and grieving those losses, we'll talk about this later, is an important part of the healing process. Because if you don't grieve those losses that are connected to these items, you're not going to be able to get rid of the items. I remember another personal example for myself of some things that I've struggled with getting rid of. I had an entire room of play therapy toys at my old office. This is now 2 offices ago. I had a specific room dedicated to seeing children and made a decision at that point in my practice that I didn't want to work as many evenings. I wanted to kind of prepare for hopefully my own family life at some point, wanted to have more work-life balance. I wasn't seeing a whole lot of kids, and it didn't make sense to have this entire room full of toys. However, it was hard to let go of those things because I had acquired them over time, over years of working with children, probably, 5 to 7 years. And that was hard for me to say, I'm no longer a play therapist. I'm no longer doing this type of work. And what if I regret this decision? If I get rid of all this stuff and then decide I want to work with kids later. And of course, that is a possibility, but that didn't happen to me. I'm actually very happy and pleased with that decision. And I sold those toys to a friend who was going to do more types of play therapy, expressive therapy, and hopefully got some good use out of those. Now that I've given you an overview, talk through some examples, I want to talk about the various things that can be done to help. If you recognize that this is a problem within yourself, what are some things that can be done to learn to let go of items, to not have to continue dealing with hoarding anymore? Number 1 is recognize that this is a problem that you need help with. That is really hard for any issue that we're facing, to admit that we need help with something. As we talked about before, oftentimes people who are struggling with hoarding either don't recognize that they need the help, or they recognize that they have a bit of a problem, but they think they can manage it on their own. Now, you're going to need different types of help and support. You're going to need some professional support. Hopefully you can find someone in your community or online, a therapist who has worked with hoarding in the past, to give you that professional support and perspective. You're going to need some personal support, not people who are going to come in and be overbearing or rush you to get rid of stuff, but are going to come alongside with you and work with you at your own pace. These are going to be people maybe that can help you bring some stuff to give away, to donate. Maybe they can help you move some furniture out of your house, or they can just provide that encouragement and moral support of just saying, I know this is really hard for you, but I'm so proud of you that you are tackling this issue in your life. That goes a long way. Oftentimes we underestimate the power of personal support for someone who is struggling with mental health issues. And we don't need to underestimate that because it's very valuable. Now, you may need medical help. You may need to look at medication as an option, especially if you have co-occurring disorders, something like ADHD that's getting in the way, anxiety, depression. Then, you may look at medication as an option to treat some of those things so that you can go through the behaviors and really tackle the hoarding, especially if you are working at this from a cognitive behavioral standpoint and you're having trouble making progress. I always encourage people who don't want to take medication to really, we'll try therapy, those tools, the self-help things for a little while. And then if you're not making progress, maybe we'll circle back around and evaluate whether medication might be an option at that point. Step 2, you're going to have to commit time, and I'm talking about every day or at least 5 days a week, to commit to the process of recovery, to commit to the process of cleaning up your space. Obviously, it didn't get that way overnight, and it's not going to be cured overnight. You're not just going to have an extreme home makeover, most likely. Now, The book that I talked about recommends really building up, I believe, from maybe 15 minutes a day to eventually getting to a point where you're working on this an hour a day to really make tangible progress. 3, develop a positive view of the future. We talked about how people who struggle with hoarding can be very past-oriented. The good times are behind me, reminiscing, wasn't that awesome when we did this or that? So I really want to encourage you from a Christian standpoint to visualize yourself blessing people with the items that you have and finding joy in giving, because there really is a joy that comes from giving to others that would be beneficial for you to tap into. And it'll help ease the pain of getting rid of certain items. I know that that's been my experience in terms of getting rid of things. When I was able to bless someone else with it, it was a lot easier to let those things go. Another way you can develop a positive view of the future is to really visualize what is it going to be like to have this life that you want, where you're inviting friends and family into your living room. Just really picture that in your mind. There's nothing on the couch other than people actually sitting there and maybe a couple of throw pillows. Visualize that empty space, maybe where you have boxes right now. Visualize your bank account having more money because you're not spending a bunch of money accumulating things that you don't need at yard sales, thrift stores, or on Amazon. Visualize your life without hoarding, playing with your grandchildren more often, finding a spouse, focusing on one hobby instead of trying to focus on the things that you can't do anymore. Telling yourself that the better days are ahead of you and not all your good memories are going to be found in the past anymore, because you're going to be creating new positive memories in the future, and that's going to be really awesome. Step 4, figure out how to stop acquiring new items. There's time dedicated in the Buried in Treasures book that helps with this as well. But if you don't stop acquiring new items, then you're fighting this losing battle, right? Because if you get rid of a bunch of stuff in your house and then you go to the yard sale and you buy 20 more things, then you're just going in circles. You may have to stop going to the places that you acquire stuff temporarily. So let's say that you are a shopaholic related to like Ross, TJ Maxx, some of those discount stores. Maybe you need to stay away from those places for a while until you're able to get some of the tools under your belt to be able to go in there and not acquire items. You may have to set up a rule for yourself if you're an online shopper and you're always having things mailed to you through Amazon or some of those other stores. You may set a rule for yourself where you say, okay, I am not going to buy anything until it sits in my cart for at least 24 hours, and then I'll reevaluate whether or not I actually really need that item. If you put this into play in your life, I've actually had some clients that have tried this that just felt like they were shopaholics, not even necessarily hoarders. They felt like they were spending too much money on Amazon on things that they didn't need. And I said, okay, well, set a rule for yourself that it's got to stay in your cart overnight, or it's got to stay in your cart for 24 hours so that you're not impulse purchasing. Step 5 is to do the intellectual work. This is the cognitive part of the work. Finding the belief systems that are holding you back. What are the thoughts that are keeping you stuck? So it may be something like, I need this. We tell ourselves that we need things all the time when we actually don't need them. They're often a want, the things that we tell ourselves that we need. I might use this someday. If you haven't used it in the last 3 years, you're probably not going to use it in the next 3 years. Some people have appliances for every kind of function in the kitchen when they don't use them. They may use 1 or 2 appliances and have 10. I remember getting rid of some round cake pans a while back because I realized, well, I used to do a lot of baking. I enjoyed it. It was a thing. And I thought, when was the last time I actually made a cake, number 1? And number 2, if I do make a cake, I don't tend to use the round pan because then you've got to stack 2, have the icing layer in the middle. I'm probably going to use the rectangle pan and just make the cake that way. So I got rid of those, and I don't regret it in the slightest or miss them because I wasn't using them. Now, the book has a lot of worksheets where you can ask yourself different questions to evaluate items and why you're really holding on to them. So if you want to dig in and do that work, You may have thoughts like, this is a good deal, so I have to buy it, or I can get some money out of it, so I have to sell it. This refers to things that you already own. Like, well, I can't get rid of that yet. I've got to find a way to sell it. We talked about some of these things already, but to get rid of this item would disrespect the memory of my loved one or cause me to forget them in some way. Or I can't get rid of stuff until I can sort it out perfectly and put it into the right categories. Realistically, you have to realize that whatever space you have, it can only hold so many items. Going back to the visualization, let's say that you have 10 pictures, but you can only fit 5 in the room. That means you have 5 to get rid of, because you can have a whole lot of, especially decorations, decor type items that you don't have the space to put up or show off. And it may be time to let those things go. Along with the intellectual work, number 6 is you've got to be able to do the emotional work to either heal from the trauma or grieve the loss. Some losses can be very traumatic to us, such as the loss of a loved one or pets. Now, I have helped people process through things like watching their dog get hit by a car. That is a very traumatic loss. It's sudden, it's unexpected, there's a tendency to blame yourself, and people may think, well, how in the world is that connected to hoarding or to holding on to things? But it can be. When you are really sitting with a skilled counselor and you start to trace some of these things back, some of this tendency to hold on to things and the discomfort of letting it go, sometimes that's where it goes back to. It could be a sense of a sudden move. Those can also be traumatic. Maybe you had to leave a place suddenly. Maybe you lost a bunch of items in a fire. I don't know. But processing through that trauma can really be beneficial. Having a long-term illness or injury, a chronic health condition, an injury that has prevented you from doing other things. There may be things that you're not able to do that you used to be able to do. That's a loss that a lot of times we don't acknowledge within ourselves and specifically within our society. That if you go through something like whether it's cancer or whether it's an autoimmune disorder, and all of a sudden there are these limitations that you haven't had before, there is some grief and loss associated with that. You don't have the energy that you used to have. You don't have maybe the same supports that you used to have. There could be all different kind of factors in there. Oftentimes when we're talking about loss, there's the big loss, right? Whether it's the loss of the person. And then there's all the little losses that go along with it. So for example, if I, worst case scenario, lost my husband Steve tomorrow, if he died in some way, then there would be all of these little things that Steve does and just kind of takes care of. It could be something as little as he feeds the cats in the morning and in the evening. Now, every time I go to feed the cat, I'm thinking, oh, Steve used to do that. That's a reminder. These bigger losses, there's all these little things that can get wrapped up and connected into them. And if we don't take time to really process that and to cry and to journal and to grieve and to let go, then we're missing out on being able to work through that grief. Unfortunately, I don't know how it is in a lot of other places, but in America, people rush through the grief process. They go from one thing and it's like tomorrow's a new day and they just expect themselves to move on and not have any issues. Unfortunately, that's not the way that we work, that our minds and emotions and body works. We need to be able to take time to process, to grieve, to let go. Number 7, as with all forms of OCD, since this is an OCD spectrum disorder, a person with hoarding is going to have to learn to be able to sit with the discomfort that comes from letting go of items. Because there is going to be some discomfort that comes. And the whole point of doing this work on the front end, the intellectual work, the emotional work, the spiritual work, is to be able to get to a place where you can sit with that discomfort, where it's to a manageable level, that you can work through it so that it's not a traumatic issue getting rid of things. Because if someone just were to come in tomorrow and clean out your stuff and you struggle with hoarding, that would be traumatic for you. You wouldn't want that to happen. However, you want to be able to pace yourself and go through this process so that you can get to a place where you're mindful in your space, how you're feeling, what thoughts you're having about getting rid of things. And then you can sit with the discomfort, work through it so that it's not as uncomfortable as it is initially looking at getting rid of an item. Now, since this is a Christian podcast, I want to talk about this from a spiritual perspective for a moment. Jesus talks about storing up treasures in heaven and not on the earth. There's also a parable about a man who basically becomes rich, gathers a bunch of grain, stores things, and then next thing you know, he dies and none of it really matters that he had all these acquisition of items. And because in the end, he died and he had to give an account for his soul at that point. We know that God doesn't want us to have anything as an idol that's over him. You shall have no other gods before me, or not have graven images. And a lot of times we think that, we don't have idols like people have idols maybe in other places, but we all have idols in our lives that we have to confess and work through, whether that idol is stuff, money, relationship. It could be so many different things. Power, prestige, that people are putting above their relationship with God. And so understanding and confessing and recognizing that stuff can become an idol in your life, even if you don't want it to, that's something that can creep up on you. And so addressing this from a spiritual perspective, really working through in prayer and confessing to God that the stuff has become out of control, and that you want to give that control back over to him, that you want to be able to release these items, and allowing prayer to become a part of this process, I think would be helpful and important for you. Prayer can be a process also in processing through the grief and loss emotions, like really telling God how you feel, what you think, why you feel like you have to hold on to this stuff. And as we're praying and as we're processing through those things, God works on our heart, allows things to be a little bit easier and a little bit easier as you commit to that work, to letting it go. Really praying through what is a good time of the day maybe for me to work on this, whether it's in the morning, whether it's in the evening, whether it's right after you get off work. How are you going to do this? Allowing this spiritual sense of godly accountability in your life, confessing to someone else that this is an issue. There's so many ways that you could incorporate spirituality in terms of healing from hoarding disorder. God does not want us to be ruled or owned by anything, and that includes our stuff. We did another episode a while back. If you have not heard it, I would encourage you to go back and listen to it, and that's episode 49 on will less stuff equal less anxiety. That episode is a personal story about Christian minimalism. It's a very good episode that has a lot of spiritual ties in it as well. So I encourage you to listen to that one for more spiritual applications in terms of getting rid of stuff. So if you've been listening to the show for a while, you know that at the end of every podcast, I like to share a story of hope, which is a time where someone received hope from God or another person. And often I ask my guests that question. Since this is a solo episode, I have to come up with stories of hope for you from my own life. And here's one that came to me recently. If you've been following along with the podcast and myself and my own journey with my husband, Steve, you know that we just had a beautiful little daughter named Faith, and she is fabulous. We are so excited to have her in our lives. And it's been a long road to get to having Faith. And so that's how she got the name of Faith, of course, because there were so many things. I waited probably over 10 years to become a mother from the time that I started my foster care journey. So one day I'm holding my daughter and she's asleep and looking absolutely adorable. And it's just really these beautiful times that we have for me to be able to pray over her and to thank God for her. And I was having this moment with my daughter that was just really beautiful and spiritual. And something happened where I started to really ponder God and God being all knowing and God being sovereign in the world. And I thought, okay, so God knew ahead of time that I was going to have this moment with my daughter. And I don't mean like he knew ahead of time as in earlier in the day. I mean, God knew that I was going to have this baby and be sitting here watching her sleeping, feeling incredibly blessed. God knew that 10 years ago when I lost my foster daughters. And God knew that I was going to have this moment several years ago when my first husband wanted a divorce and walked out the door and wanted nothing else to do with me. And all these painful moments of my life, I'm going to talk about my daughter's birth story related to my pregnancy in a future episode, but there were some complications that came up at the end, shall we say, where I had this higher chance of stillbirth. And of course, that's very scary when a doctor tells you that. So here I'm going through this, crying and praying, like, don't let me lose this baby now that I've gone through all of this. And in that moment, God knew I was going to have this beautiful moment where I'm thanking him because my daughter is here now. So whatever you're going through right now may be incredibly painful, and you may not see anything good in it or anything good coming out of it or anything beautiful arriving later, because when I went through some of those painful experiences in my life, I didn't see how they could be good on the other side, and just really so angry or frustrated or sad with God and in how some of those situations turned out. But God had a plan. He knew what he was doing. And it's so hard for us in the now to trust him. But that's what I encourage you to do with whatever's messy and uncomfortable and scary in your life, to really lean in and trust God, to know that he wants to bless you with these beautiful moments. If you are serving him, if you are seeking to honor him, that he wants to make the beauty from the ashes and heal you from this pain that you're experiencing. And there is a beautiful and wonderful gift on the other side at the end of our pain and suffering that we don't see, we have no concept of at the time. So that's my story of hope for you today. I hope that encourages you. Hope for Anxiety and OCD is a production of By the Well Counseling. Our show is hosted by me, Carrie Bock, licensed professional counselor in Tennessee. Opinions given by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of myself or By the Well Counseling. Our original music is by Brandon Mangroom. Until next time, may you be comforted by God's great love for you.